The hatred between Israel and Iran didn't begin with missiles. It didn't begin with uranium. It didn't begin with modern speeches or angry leaders pointing fingers at each other on television. The relationship between the Jewish tradition and Persia did not necessarily begin in hostility. If we want to understand why today so many people see Israel and Iran as two forces destined to collide, we have to go back thousands of years. Far beyond geopolitics, far beyond borders, far beyond even the name Iran. There are conflicts that are born in a parliament, but this one is born in a sacred story. Despite what many believe, the Bible does not present modern Iran as the original enemy of Israel. To understand the conflict, we need to go back to the desert where it all began, with Abraham, a man whose descendants would leave their mark on history. Back in the day, there were no flags, no borders, no modern maps, no names like Israel or Iran. There was only sand, wind, and a promise that refused to arrive on time. An old man, a woman tired of waiting, and a vast silent sky, as if it already knew how much this story was going to hurt. Abraham was not yet the father of opposing peoples. He was not yet the name millions would pronounce centuries later. At that moment, he was just an old man carrying a promise, a massive promise, disproportionate, almost cruel. God had told him that from him would come an uncountable lineage, a line that would not fade with his death, a story larger than his body, larger than his time, greater than anything he could grasp. And yet every morning when he opened his eyes, reality was the same. No son, no fulfillment, no successor in the line. And when waiting lasts too long, it starts to change people. It makes them more fragile, more impatient, more wounded. Sarah felt it in silence. She felt it in her aging body, in the quiet humiliation of not being able to give Abraham what seemed to be the center of the promise. She felt it in every glance toward the horizon, in every night under the stars, in every sunrise that brought no reply. Because it wasn't just the desire for a child, it was something deeper. It was the feeling of being left out of the very story God Himself had spoken. Some pains don't scream, they just stay inside. And Sarah's must have been under one of them, watching time pass, convinced the sky owes you a reply. A curious detail is that Sarah, Hagar, Ishmael, and Isaac appear in a deeply domestic story, not on a battlefield, feeling the promise that grew heavier every year, hearing Abraham continue to believe while reality refused to change. The problem wasn't just that the child wasn't coming. The problem was that the longer the promise took, the more space it occupied inside the house. More tension, more anxiety, more need to act. Humans rarely handle uncertainty well, particularly when they feel their destiny is at stake. So a decision that changed everything came. It wasn't born from evil. It was born from desperation. Sarah looked at Hagar, her Egyptian servant, and thought what most people in her position would think. If God doesn't act the way we expected, maybe we have to help Him. Maybe we have to push the story forward, force the fulfillment, build with human hands what hasn't yet come down from heaven. And so inside that family, a crack began to open. It didn't look like a crack yet. It looked like a solution. Hagar entered the story not as an enemy, but as an instrument, as a practical answer to a pain that no longer fit inside Sarah. But solutions born from wounds rarely come clean, because once Hagar conceived, she stopped being just a servant. She became the woman who had given what Sarah could not. And that changes the atmosphere within a house. It changes the looks, the silences, the shadow one presence casts over another. When Ishmael was born, no one could yet see what would come after. There was only a child, a real son, a small body breathing under the same sky where before there had only been a promise. For Abraham, it must have been a mix of relief, tenderness and mystery. For Hagar, maybe it was restored dignity, maybe protection, maybe fear. But for Sarah, every breath of that child must have also sounded like a brutal reminder. The promise was still alive, yes, but it had not passed through her. And that's when the real drama began. Not between armies, not between nations, but inside a tent. Between two women, between a wound and a child, between a divine promise and a human solution. Ishmael wasn't born as a symbol of war. He was born as a son, and precisely for that reason, the wound ran deeper. Then the impossible happened. When time seemed closed, when biology had become almost a sentence, Sarah finally conceived and gave birth to Isaac. In this moment, Abraham's household stopped being a house of tension. It became something different, a divided house, because there was no longer only one child under the holy promise. Now there were two of them, Ishmael, the first, and Isaac, the child who, according to the biblical tradition, would be united to God's promise in a decisive way. Two children under the same sky, two mothers within the same wound. Two possible futures that breathed close together. What came next was inevitable, or at least it feels that way from afar. Sarah could no longer bear it, weighed down by the rivalry, the memory of humiliation, and the load of the promise. Everything exploded into a demand that would echo through centuries. Hagar and Ishmael must leave, she said. In the biblical account, Ishmael does not disappear after the expulsion. A promise was made to his descendants as well. And this is where the story stops being merely ancient and starts being eternal. As far as the history goes, what happened wasn't simply a domestic separation. It was an expulsion loaded with meaning. A cut, a line, a distinction between inside and outside. One child remains in the house of the covenant. The other is sent into the desert to wander alone under the vast sky. A father caught between love and obedience. A mother removed from the center of the story. A child growing with the mark of being set aside. This very human and very cruel gesture is one of the reasons this story has survived with such force. The problem becomes no longer about genealogy. It becomes about belonging. Who inherits? Who is recognized? And centuries later, when Jews, Christians, and Muslims look back at Abraham, they do not see just a patriarch. They see the moment a question opened that today still hasn't been closed. Who truly was the child of the promise from God? After the cruel departure, Ishmael didn't just survive the desert, he mastered it. When the water ran out, Hagar laid him under a scrub bush because she couldn't bear to watch him die. At that moment, the story says an angel appeared, not with a lecture but with a well of water. That well, also known as Zamzam, didn't just save a boy, it anchored a lineage. Ishmael grew up in the wild desert of Paran. He became an archer. He became a man of the open spaces, while Isaac was learning the rituals of his father's tents. Ishmael was learning the language of the sand. He was a wild donkey of a man, as the prophecy went, not as an insult, but as a description of a soul that could never be fenced in. He didn't have the promise in the way Isaac did, the land, the covenant, the official title promised by God, but he had a different promise. Quantity, 12 princes, 12 tribes, a nation so vast it would eventually swallow the horizons. Ishmael's descendants became the Ishmaelites, the nomads, the traders of spice and incense. They were the bridge builders of the ancient world. They didn't build temples of stone, they built empires of movement. While the children of Ishmael were mastering the wind and mapping the veins of the desert, Isaac's descendants were in chains. Their temple was burned to ash, and their songs were silenced by the heavy, humid air of Babylon. For 70 years, Isaac's descendants sat by the eastern rivers, crying vying for a home they thought the empires had taken. And then the horizon shifted. Out of the mountains of the east came a man who didn't pray to the God of Abraham, yet he would become the most important figure in the survival of the Jewish soul: Cyrus the Great. He was the son of Persia, a master of stone and law, the leader of a people who saw the world not as a desert to be conquered, but as a place to bring order. Cyrus didn't just conquer Babylon. He freed all the slaves. He looked at the exiled children of Isaac and did something that defied the logic of ancient kings. He gave them their dignity back. He didn't just permit them to leave. He reached into his own royal treasury and handed them the gold to rebuild their temple. He issued a decree that echoed across the centuries. "Go home, rebuild, be who you are," Cyrus said. In the Bible, this Persian king, this outsider, is called Messiah, the Anointed One, a title usually reserved for the holiest of their own. Yet it was given to a man from the land of Iran. For a moment in time, the story of Abraham's sons was held together by Persian hands. After Cyrus the Great, Ishmael's descendants kept moving through the periphery of Isaac's story. They were the cousins who watched from the dunes. They were the ones who eventually, through the lineage of the Quraysh, would produce a man named Muhammad. And here is where the story shifts from a family dispute to a global reality. The Islam that emerged from Ishmael's desert wasn't just a new religion. It was a reclamation project. It was Ishmael coming back to claim what was of his own. When the Islamic tide swept across the world, it eventually crashed back into the borders of an ancient, proud, and sophisticated empire. Persia embraced Islam, transforming its cities, courts, and culture. Zoroastrian temples gave way to mosques. Scholars studied the Quran, and the empire's trade and administration were reoriented under a new faith. The descendants of wandering tribes were now at the center of history, shaping faith, trade, and culture across centuries. While Ishmael was learning to hunt, Isaac was learning to bleed. The defining moment of Isaac's life wasn't a conquest. It was the Akedah, the binding. His father, Abraham, took him up a mountain, tied him to a pile of wood, and pulled a knife. If Ishmael's trauma was abandonment, Isaac's trauma was sacrifice. He grew up in the shadow of a God who demanded everything. He lived with the weight of being the chosen one, a title that sounds great until you realize it makes you a target for everyone else's resentment. From Isaac came Jacob. From Jacob came Israel. The story of the Jewish people is a story of staying, of clinging to a specific piece of dirt because that dirt was the only thing promised to them when the world felt like a void. Judaism became a religion of memory, a religion of law, a religion of survival against impossible odds, while Ishmael's descendants were building vast caliphates that stretched from Spain to India. Isaac's descendants were being scattered, hounded, and marginalized. When the modern state of Israel was founded in 1948, it wasn't just a political event. For the children of Isaac, it was the end of the exile. It was the favored son finally coming home to the house Sarah had fought so hard to protect. But the house wasn't empty. They found the children of Ishmael, who had been tilling that soil, naming those hills, and burying their dead in that dust for 13 centuries. To the Palestinian, 1948 was the Nakba, the catastrophe. It was the moment the world decided that the debt of Europe's sins of the Holocaust would be paid in Arab land. The abandoned son felt abandoned once more, watching from across a new, jagged border, as his olive groves were harvested by strangers who claimed a divine right to the soil. The decade following 1948 wasn't peaceful. It was a long, shallow breath before a scream. In 1967, the world tilted again. In 6 days, Israel didn't just defend the house, they took the whole place. For the Jews reaching the Western Hebron wall was like touching the very stone where the binding of Isaac had happened. A return to the absolute center of their soul. They felt for the first time in 2 millennia that they were no longer victims of history, but its masters. But for the children of Ishmael, 1967 was the day the walls closed in. The wilderness was no longer a distant desert. It was their own backyard. They became a people watched from above, living in a geography of no passing here, no building there. Do not claim your soil. The displacement of 1948 became the occupation of 1967, and the quiet resentment turned into boil. As the decades passed, the brothers stopped speaking and began to gesture with violence. The popular revolts of the Palestinians, also known as the Intifadas, were the scream of the abandoned son who refused to be silenced by the desert. Ishmael threw stones against tanks, a David and Goliath reversal that confused the world's moral compass. The walls were Isaac's response. He built a security fence of concrete and steel. He traded the possibility of a neighbor for the certainty of a fortress, finally claiming the land he once had in the past. And now comes the part of the story that never gets into the news. Abraham, the man who started it all, finally grew old. The fires of his passion had cooled. The voices of the sky had grown quiet. At 175 years old, the father of nations breathed his last. And then something miraculous happened. The Bible says that Isaac and Ishmael buried him. Think about that. Ishmael had been gone for decades. He was a king in the desert, a man with his own scars and his own glory. Isaac was the heir, the one who stayed by the bedside. But when the old man died, the brothers found each other again. They met at the cave of Machpelah in Hebron. There were no missiles. There were no leaders fighting each other. There were no iron domes or military forces. There were just 2 middle-aged men, gray-bearded and weary, carrying the heavy body of the man who had loved them both and failed them both. They stood together in the darkness of that cave. They laid their father next to Sarah, the woman who had driven Ishmael away. They likely didn't speak much. What was there to say? The wound was too old. The history was too long. At that moment, they weren't the founders of 2 world religions. They weren't the symbols of Judaism and Islam. They were just 2 sons who missed their dad. For a brief window of time, there was peace. They shared the weight of the stretcher. They shared the silence of the tomb. They recognized, if only for an afternoon, that they both bled the same Abrahamic blood. Then they walked out of the cave, turned their backs on each other, and returned to their separate worlds. Today, the silence of the cave of Machpelah has been replaced by the roar of drones and the rhetoric of annihilation. The conflict between Israel and Iran is often framed as a clash of modern ideologies. Democracy versus theocracy, West versus East. But if you look closer, it's the same domestic dispute, just with a much larger budget. Iran, acting as the self-appointed guardian of the Ishmaelite legacy, feels the deep ancient sting of the outcast. They see an international system that they believe favors Isaac, that validates Isaac's chosenness, while trying to box Ishmael into the desert. Their hostility isn't just about territory, it's about validation. It's about demanding that the world recognize their place in the story. Israel, on the other hand, lives in a state of perpetual binding. They feel that at any moment, the knife could be pulled again. Their survivalism is built into their marrow. When they look at Iran, they don't just see a country. They see the wild man of the prophecy coming to reclaim the house by force. We are living in the what if that Sarah and Hagar never considered. What if the children grow up and never learn to share the world? The tragedy of the modern Israel-Iran conflict is that both sides are operating out of a sense of divine right and historical grievance that is so deep, it bypasses the brain and goes straight to the nervous system. It is a war of 2 ghosts, the ghost of the boy who was almost sacrificed and the ghost of the boy who was sent away to die. There is a seat at the table that remains empty. It's the seat where the brothers sat together and buried their father in Hebron. Today, the leaders in Jerusalem and Tehran speak as if they were total strangers, as if they have nothing in common but hatred. They have become experts in the architecture of distance. They build walls out of ancient grievances and reinforce them with modern steel, forgetting that the foundation of both houses is laid in the same dust. They forget that their letters differ, yet their prayers echo the same. They forget that they both claim to worship the God of Abraham, a God who, according to the story, heard the cries of both sons. The promise that Abraham carried was supposed to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. It wasn't meant to be a battle of winners and losers, yet humans managed to turn blessings into walls. We take a vast, silent sky and we carve it up into flight paths for rockets. The conflict between Israel and Iran won't be solved by a nuclear deal or a faster missile. It can only be solved when both sides realize they are fighting over a father who is already dead, in a house that is big enough for everyone, if they would just stop trying to burn it down to prove who owns the lease. Isaac and Ishmael found peace in a graveyard. The question for us, thousands of years later, is whether we can find it anywhere else.